Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer evaluates the inequalities that are prevalent in the Indian economy and the Indian society, particularly income and social inequalities, and he calls for the adoption of an inclusive and equitable model of growth and development. According to the writer, the breakout of the pandemic last year acted as a stress event on the Indian economy and it exposed the structural flaws in the Indian economy. According to him, India's model of socio-economic development and India's model of economic growth and development is flawed because it is largely skewed in favor of the rich and the upper classes. The writer says that the income and social divides that existed in the pre pandemic world have been further widened by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns. Initially, even though the pandemic disrupted every section of the economy, and even though it affected every individual in the country, gradually the rich and the upper classes have been able to recover from the impact, whereas the pandemic and the lockdown have had a disproportionate impact on the poor people and the lower sections of the society. After an initial setback to medium and large businesses, the Indian economy has managed to stage a V shaped recovery, and the rich in particular have gotten even richer in the post pandemic era, as evidenced in the rapid recovery of the Indian stock market. The rich and the well off, they were able to protect their health and even recover their income and social status, primarily due to their deep pockets and access to quality services. Whereas the poor, on the other hand, were largely left to fend for themselves, and particularly the migrant workers and the small businesses have taken a huge hit. And with very little support from the government and the industry, the migrant class and the lower sections of the society, and even small and micro enterprises, they have suffered a disproportionate impact as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. According to a recent study conducted by the World Bank, 75 million Indians entered into the poverty bracket during the pandemic. Now, this is a direct reflection of India's glaring inequality because, according to this study, India alone accounted for 60% of the global rise in poverty after the breakout of the pandemic. This is just one illustration of the hardships being faced by India's lower classes. And there is a huge income and social gap that divides the poor from the richer classes. Unfortunately, government policies and regulations seem to favor the industry and the rich, in the belief that large businesses can trigger economic activity and growth, followed by the trickling down of economic benefits to the lower sections of the society. According to the writer, this sole belief in industry led growth and development has contributed to the widening inequities in the society, where the rich are getting richer day by day and the poor are being left behind and are being left to fend for themselves. To highlight the prevailing inequalities in the Indian economy, the writer refers to India's ranking on several important global reports. For example, in the latest Global Hunger Report, India has been ranked at the 94th position out of 107 countries that were covered by the report. Then, in the World Happiness Report for 2021, which was brought out by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, India was ranked amongst the least happy countries in the world with a ranking of 144 out of 153 countries. Apart from these socio-economic indicators, even environmental standards in India have gone down considerably due to blind focus on industry-led development. In terms of water quality and air quality as well, India's ranking is extremely low and it ranks at the 120th and 179th position respectively. These poor socio-economic factors and environmental factors, they have very little impact on the rich, whereas they affect the poor disproportionately. Let's say if the water quality is poor and the water is polluted, the rich and the upper classes can afford filtered water, whereas the poor are left to fend for themselves. The same inequality in services can be seen in the domains of nutrition, healthcare, education, and as well as with regard to employment opportunities and income. While these are the established facts, it is quite shocking that a union minister had recently criticized the Global Hunger Report for being biased against India. And as the writer points out, he had stated that these foreign reports should not be taken seriously because it is not possible for Indians to go hungry due to the kindness of Indians. The minister had stated that in India, due to the kindness of people, even dogs do not go hungry. Then how is it possible for people to be left hungry? And by placing this questionable argument, he called upon the people to ignore such global reports. The writer contradicts these statements of the Union Minister because, see, hunger has nothing to do with kindness. These reports are a result of objective assessments carried out by experts by tracking key indicators and parameters. While it is true that some institutions and some reports can be biased or flawed, India can ignore these reports and deride them only at its own cost. Because if you look at the Global Hunger Index, for example, it measures the extent of malnutrition in the country. And it's a well established fact that malnutrition is widely prevalent in the Indian society. The writer says that the rich, the powerful, and the upper classes tend to draw such wrongful assumptions based on their belief that the success or failure of a person or of a community is entirely their own responsibility. We refer to this ideology as individualism, where the individual's well being is seen to be disconnected from societal factors. Under individualism, it is assumed that the society and the environment is having no impact on the overall well being and performance of the individual. Those who subscribe to the ideology, they deny that societal conditions are responsible for the difficulties of the poor people, and this leads to drawing up of such assumptions and conclusions. So the writer says that the governance machinery in the country needs to be more empathetic and use these reports and indices as a guide to recognize and acknowledge the existing inequities in the society, because only through such honest evaluation can we come out with new strategies and frameworks that can lead the country towards equitable and inclusive growth. See, most governments and the industry, they are obsessed with GDP-led growth. And despite the hard lessons of the pandemic, the obsessive focus on GDP-led growth has come back, even at the cost of further degrading the environmental and social standards. Now, we need to remember that any further degradation of our environment and any further dilution of our social standards, they are going to disproportionately affect the poor people. And unless and until GDP-led growth can contribute to the equitable rise of income of all people in the country, it won't be helping in addressing the challenges of inequity, but instead, it's just going to further aggravate the income and social divides in the country. Hence, the writer calls for a new architecture of economic growth, which is focused on the grassroots so that it can improve the standard of living of majority of the population in the country and not just a small subsection of the country's population. He takes the example of Nordic countries and Scandinavian countries to highlight how their community-driven approach towards development has directly contributed to a high degree of human development in those countries. For example, look at countries such as Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, etc. In all these countries, an inclusive and equitable model of development has been adopted with utmost focus on social security, and a community-owned and community-led model of growth and development is promoted. The writer says that governments at the center and at the provincial level, they will never be successful in completely understanding the local challenges in the local context. And hence, he calls upon the governments to create a new framework for development that prioritizes community-led development, where local institutions and grassroots institutions are given the lead role to identify the local problems and to find solutions for them. As the country is busy in making grand preparations to celebrate the 75th anniversary of India's independence, the writer is asking the citizens to question whether what matters is the size of the GDP and the number of billionaires and billionaires from India, or should it be the day-to-day conditions of millions of poor people that should matter? Next, we have another column on page number 6, in which the writer evaluates the quality of education and academic excellence in India's higher education institutions, such as the IITs. See, it is often believed that when it comes to higher education, especially in science and technology, that the only way to improve quality of higher education is by focusing on quantity. Driven by this belief, there is often unnecessary focus on the number of institutions, on the location of the campus, the size of the campus, and such externalities are prioritized in the belief that somehow focus on quantity will improve quality, leading to academic excellence. If you look at the case of IITs, usually the IITs located in urban centers receive more focus and attention as compared to those institutions located in remote areas. Often it is suggested to set up more IIT like institutions in urban and industrial centers with large campuses and with adequate infrastructure and investments. While these factors are needed to create the essential infrastructure, they alone won't determine the quality of academic excellence. Instead, it is the quality of mentorship that students receive that determines the success of a country's higher education system. The writer says that the primary objective of any higher education institution should be to promote scientific discovery and the spirit of inquiry among students by providing them with the right kind of exposure to science, technology, politics, society, environment, etc. Students should be encouraged to think and write freely, and the institutions should instill self confidence in the students and nudge them to the path of innovation and transform the students not just into job seekers but into job providers by cultivating their entrepreneurial spirit. According to the writer, ensuring these objectives lies entirely in the hands of the faculties. That's the reason why he argues that remoteness is no hindrance to academic excellence. He says that excellence in education, especially in higher education, depends on the quality of mentorship that students receive and not on the size of the campus or the location of the campus. If someone believes that only large institutions with large campuses located in city and industrial centers can produce academic excellence, then it would be similar to believing that only large corporations and well funded companies can innovate as compared to smaller companies and startups. In today's culture of innovation, we all know that many startups have managed to even beat large corporations, and it is largely in the country's startup ecosystem where most of the innovation is taking place. By the same logic, in higher education as well, the size of the institution, its location, its funding are not the only factors that matter, but instead, it is the quality of mentorship and the quality of education that the students receive, which will eventually determine the academic excellence of the institution. If this needs to happen, the primary focus of higher education reforms should be on the faculties, because currently India's higher education institutions, especially IITs, are critically understaffed and there is a huge shortage of qualified faculties. The writer points out how the student to teacher ratio is declining day by day, and upon the existing shortage of faculties, the existing faculties are being overburdened with several non academic responsibilities. For example, there are cases where senior faculties are being asked to run canteens, manage placement cells, and to get themselves involved in campus renovation and campus building works. Such mandatory and forced involvement in non academic activities not only overburdens the faculties, but it also drains their energy and resources. Such involvement in non academic activities reduces the academic excellence of the faculties, thereby affecting the mentorship of students. Then, upon this, even IIT faculties are grossly underpaid, which further has a direct impact on their motivation and morale. While faculties seem to thrive in the private sector, no serious attempts are being made to improve the living conditions and the salaries of faculties in institutions such as IITs. Upon this, the institutions seem to be following a very poorly designed recruitment process, which again prioritizes quantity and numbers over quality and merit. In the current recruitment process, unnecessary weightage is given for the number of research papers published, for the quantum of grants that the applicant might have received, and also there seems to be blind focus on experience and marks. While these factors are important, it is also equally important to focus on the pedagogic abilities of the teacher. Hence, the writer argues that it is not the size or the location of the campus that matters, but instead, it is the quality of mentorship that determines academic excellence. He cites the examples of IITs located in remote locations, such as IIT Ropar, IIT Mandi, and the others, which have managed to do considerably well despite their limited resources and despite their remote location. He cites the example of Cornell University of the United Kingdom, which is located in rural England, and also the Okinawa Institute of Science of Japan, which is located on the remote island of Okinawa. Despite their remoteness, these are some of the finest universities in the world, and this should be seen as a lesson to India's higher education system as well. So, in short, the focus of India's higher education reforms should not be on just the size or location of the campus, but it should be more on the quality of mentorship, which results in academic excellence. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 that evaluates the recent visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Bangladesh, along with the contours of the India-Bangladesh relationship. But this topic has been covered in detail on the 26th of March, so I kindly request you to go back and watch this video and then go through this editorial once. Next, let's take a look at this article from page number 13. Global leaders have pushed for a new pandemic treaty. See, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a learning lesson for the whole world, and it has highlighted the importance of coordinated response in mitigating and containing the spread of a pandemic. Unfortunately, there is no global framework or a treaty or a convention that provides for coordination and cooperation between the countries to deal with a pandemic. The lack of such a treaty inhibits the timely sharing of information, it prevents the pooling of technology and resources to combat the pandemic, and it also affects the abilities of countries to work with each other with regard to the joint development of vaccines and treatments. So, following these crucial and valuable lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, global leaders from around 25 countries, along with the European Union and the World Health Organization, have come together and have given a call for the establishment of a new pandemic treaty that can help prepare the world for the next pandemic. Recently, a joint article was written by several leaders from around 25 countries, and this article, which was published in most major newspapers, called upon the global community to put in place a new pandemic treaty that can promote coordination and cooperation amongst the countries while dealing with a pandemic. Now, coming to the mains practice questions, let's look at the first one. India does not shine when only some gleam. Critically evaluate the statement in the context of glaring inequalities found in India. The second question, excellence in education depends on the quality of mentorship and not on the size or location of campuses. Evaluate the statement in the context of India's higher education. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.